That takes us to our readings for today. A little background on the authors first. They both died roughly the same time in the early 1960s, so they were close contemporaries. And both of these writers are associated with something known as the modernist movement. When we refer to modernism as a literary kind of genre, what we usually mean associated with a kind of writing that was typical in the early half of the 20th century. And modernists were typically known for a kind of realistic style combined with a belief in a deep alienation between people and the world around them. So while you might think of, say, earlier writers as trying to find close associations between the natural world and kind of human psychology or human existence, say like someone like Walt Whitman, writers in the earlier part of the 20th century usually thought of themselves as being kind of alienated from their world around them. They were also very interested in the idea that their characters should exhibit a kind of psychological complexity where motives or characteristics were never really detailed on the subject, but accessed through sort of difficult signs, so that in modernist writing, subtext is often much more important than the text in a lot of ways. In other words, we derive meanings from the works by examining sort of subtle clues or things not said as much as things that are said directly. And I would say that this is absolutely true of both of the writers we're reading today, and certainly true of both the works that we're dealing with today. First of all, a little background on Hills Like White Elephants. It's a very typical Hemingway story in that it is about a group of expatriate Americans living in Europe between the world wars. Hemingway was famous for basing his stories, his characters, on people in this particular situation. In fact, there was a nickname that he adopted, the Lost Generation, which referred to this particular group of literati, expatriate Americans that were living in Europe in the 1920s. Specifically, the story we're looking at today, Hills Like White Elephants, deals with a pair of Americans traveling in Spain during the 20s. And hopefully you got enough out of the story your first time through it to know that the couple are romantically involved, but they're coming to an important crossroads in the relationship. And hopefully you noticed at least there's some conflict between the man and the woman, even if you weren't quite sure exactly what that conflict is the first time through. If you didn't get it, don't be worried because, as I said, modernist writing is often dependent on what's not said. And I think the key conflict in the story is very much something that Hemingway does not tell us initially. So let's turn specifically to Hemingway's style. This is the opening paragraph. It's the first page of the handout. You'll note the handout's kind of weird. It starts on page 229. But anyway, this is Hemingway's opening paragraph. Okay, so several things there. Your book tells you the Ebro is actually a river in Spain, and they're waiting on the train from Barcelona to Madrid. But there's several things I want to note about this. It's a very Hemingway-esque kind of description of the landscape and of the characters within it. And what I mean by that is it is completely lacking in ornate detail or the kinds of things we might conventionally call sort of creative gestures or verbs, right? We think about the description, the Ebro, the valley between the Ebro were long and white. On this side, there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between the two lines of rails in the sun. Close against the side of the station, there was the warm shadow of the building. Now, what I want to note about this is the degree in which this very similar verb construction works in all of these levels of description, right? It's always the verb to be, or the past tense of is or are, were, was. I don't know if you've ever taken creative writing classes, but one of the things they'll usually tell you right away is that this kind of verb construction is something you kind of want to avoid in creative writing because it's just not very descriptive. For example, the sun does not cast shadows, or the station is not nestled between a couple of hills. In Hemingway's description, everything just simply is something, right? And it's usually not particularly descriptive or not very evocative of feeling. Hemingway uses it as just very sparse description, and that really kind of applies to our notion of characters too. The American and the girl. We get slightly more nomination of them throughout the story, but that's basically it. That's how we identify them and how we know them, right? So it is not a particularly detailed or evocative kind of description. I don't mean by that it's bad. I just mean it's simple. And in some ways, what Hemingway is doing here is he's just sort of using or suggesting ideas that he doesn't want to fully elaborate on or give us, right? I think it's an important question why he just calls these people the American and the girl, and that might be something we'll return to. But it's definitely not a layered kind of description, right? And we can see not only here this in his descriptions, but also sort of his characterization and sometimes his explanation of his themes, right? This is a important passage, right? And this is on page 230. And what I want to point out here is a couple of things. Is one, how completely understated what's going on is in the course of the story. This is sort of the main plot of the story, yet Hemingway won't tell us exactly what's happening at all. And on the other hand, how we move from a very sort of simple conversation to the crux of the matter without much definition or much sense of transition, right? We're sort of jumping from A to B really quickly. So the two of them are sitting there together. The beer is nice and cool, the man said. It's lovely, the girl said. It's really awfully simple operation, Jig, the man said. It's not really an operation at all. The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in. The girl did not say anything. I'll go with you, and I'll stay with you all the time. They just let the air in, and it's all perfectly natural. Then what will we do afterward? We'll be fine afterward, just like we were before. Now, if you missed sort of crux of the matter here, again, I don't blame you. But what's happening in this instance of the story is that the man is trying to talk his girlfriend into having an abortion, right? So they're a couple, and she's become pregnant, and he's trying to convince her to have an abortion, but he's doing it in a kind of roundabout way. And she, likewise, is not saying exactly what she means, but she has different issues or ideas about the relationship because of what's happening. And they're both talking around each other rather than directly to each other about this issue and about their feelings of the matter, right? So there's a lot going on in what Hemingway is not saying here. It can make for a confusing story, but it also forces us as readers to really sort of read between the lines and pay close attention to these sorts of details, right? So the willingness of the man to sort of move into the subject matter, again, without any sort of sense of transition, and perhaps not a lot of concern for the girl's feelings, the girl's reticence to listen to what he says, but then later on, if you pay close attention to the story, the degree in which she doesn't assert any sort of desire on her own to assert her own wishes or desires about the situation. So this, again, like in the same way that the story has a sort of level of detail or description of the landscape that's kind of sparse, the same true with the characterization and even the description of the plot. It's not overdrawn. In fact, it's very much understated. Right?